So I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
First, U.S. President Donald Trump takes Russian President Vladimir Putin's word over that of U.S. intelligence. It was about Russia's interference in the 2016 election that Trump won to become president of the United States. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. Today, U.S. foreign policy after the Trump-Putin summit. And amid criticism from U.S. allies, Democrats, and even many Republicans, the president's party, and just one day after the historic summit, now U.S. President Donald Trump is trying to clarify a response. The clarification is to a question about Russia's interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. At the press conference after the summit and standing next to Vladimir Putin, Trump had implied that he accepted Putin's denial of election interference over the conclusions of U.S. intelligence agencies. Now, U.S. intelligence says Putin orchestrated the U.S. election meddling. The U.S. and Russia summit ended a week of overseas travel for President Trump, and that trip began with Trump's prediction of how the summit would work out.
So I have NATO, I have the UK, which is in somewhat turmoil, and I have Putin. Frankly, Putin may be the easiest of them all. Who would think? I really can't say right now. As far as I'm concerned, a competitor. It's a competitor. I think that getting along with Russia, getting along with China, getting along with others is a good thing, not a bad thing. I've said that many times. We do have a lot of allies, but we cannot be taken advantage of. We're being taken advantage of by the European Union.
We have a very good relationship. Because of me, they've raised about $40 billion over the last year. So I think the Secretary General likes Trump. He may be the only one, but that's okay with me. Now, if you look at it, Germany is a captive of Russia because they supply. They got rid of their coal plants. They got rid of their nuclear. They're getting so much of the oil and gas from Russia. I think it's something that NATO has to look at. I think it's very inappropriate. You and I agree that it's inappropriate. But I believe in NATO. I think NATO is very important, probably the greatest ever done. But the United States was paying for anywhere from 70 to 90% of it, depending on the way you calculate. That's not fair to the United States. In addition to that, as you know, we're in negotiations with the EU, and we're going to be meeting with them next week. We've been treated very unfairly on trade. Our farmers have been shut out of the European Union. Now, you could say they're different, but basically, to a large extent, they're the same countries.
Who's your biggest competitor, your biggest foe globally right now?
Well, I think we have a lot of foes. I think the European Union is a foe, what they do to us in trade. Now, you wouldn't think of the European Union, but they're a foe. Russia's a foe in certain respects. China's a foe economically, certainly. They're a foe.
I actually told Theresa May how to do it, but she didn't agree with it. She didn't listen to me.
What did you say?
She didn't listen. No, I told her how to do it. That will be up to her to say. But I told her how to do it. She wanted to go a different route. Because I didn't criticize the Prime Minister. I have a lot of respect for the Prime Minister. And unfortunately, there was a story that was done, which was, generally fine, but it didn't put in what I said about the Prime Minister. And I said tremendous things. And fortunately, we tend to record stories now, so we have it for your enjoyment if you'd like it. But we record when we deal with reporters. It's called fake news. I know you'll ask, will we be talking about meddling? And I will absolutely bring that up. I don't think you'll have any, gee, I did it, you got me. There won't be a Perry Mason here, I don't think, but you never know what happens, right? But I will absolutely, firmly ask the question. All I can do is ask the question. My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. So I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today. And what he did is an incredible offer. He offered to have the people working on the case come and work with their investigators with respect to the 12 people. I think that's an incredible offer. Okay, thank you.
Politico White House bureau chief Steve Herman was on the trip, so he had a front row seat to all of this, and he just got back from Helsinki to open up his reporter's notebook for us. Nice to see you, Steve.
It's a pleasure to be here, Greta.
Okay, Steve, while you're flying back to the United States, President Trump seemed to backtrack and try to correct the record about his remarks about President Putin and the election meddling and who he believed. Now, here's what President Trump said at the summit in response to a question about whether he believed Putin's denial that Russia interfered in the U.S. election or his own intelligence agencies, who conclude that Putin did orchestrate the interference.
With that being said, all I can do is ask the question. My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be.
Now, that remark by the U.S. president started a political media firestorm here in the United States and even around the world. President Trump then went into damage control, saying his comment in Helsinki was a misstatement. Now, here's what the president said the next day when he got back to the White House.
I thought that I made myself very clear by having just reviewed the transcript. Now, I have to say, I came back and I said, what is going on? What's the big deal? So I got a transcript. I reviewed it. I actually went out and reviewed a clip of an answer that I gave. And I realized that there is a need for some clarification. It should have been obvious. I thought it would be obvious, but I would like to clarify just in case it wasn't. In a key sentence in my remarks, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why I wouldn't or why it wouldn't be Russia. So just to repeat it, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. And the sentence should have been, and I thought it would be maybe a little bit unclear on the transcript or unclear on the actual video. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be Russia. Sort of a double negative. So you can put that in, and I think that probably clarifies things pretty good by itself.
Okay, Steve, you had two historic trips in about 3 weeks,
Right.
One with the president to meet with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, and now this trip to multiple cities in Europe and meeting with the president of Russia. But let me turn first to the would not. Can you add some more light to this?
Well, as the president was just trying to say in those clips you ran, that this was some sort of grammatical mistake, but I think people can judge for themselves what he intended to say and what he did or did not say. Also, in that remark at the White House, he then added a little bit extra on, leaving again open the possibility that there could have been meddling by someone else besides Russia as well. So that was obviously a prepared statement. You could tell from his body language that he was reluctant to read it. And then had to add something on, as he usually does, stepping on his own message.
Well, is there any sort of discussion at the White House or even among colleagues about the fact that after he met with Vladimir Putin at that summit, in which he said that there was a misstatement, he had a couple of interviews with the media, and I don't know if there was that correction then, and it wasn't until he got back here in the United States.
Those were not mentioned in the interviews that he did.
Is there any sense at the White House that this is, are they scrambling for this, or do they see this would not as sort of behind them, or do they see this as, they've got a rough few days and maybe even a longer time over this?
Possibly. I think that the clarification, perhaps with some of the Fox News commentators who've been very strongly supportive of the president, and maybe former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, they might be satisfied by this explanation. But we're still seeing that other Republicans are quite concerned. And, of course, Democrats are not being at all persuaded by it.
And since we have an international audience, we probably should explain to those who don't follow us that Fox News is generally, at least in the past few months, thought to be much more sympathetic to President Trump than some of the other news outlets.
Sure. I found overseas people are quite familiar with Fox News and its connection to the president.
All right, well, good. Then I don't need to say anything about that. And that's, of course, where I once worked. All right, now I want the sort of the color. You were in the room at this press conference.
Right.
The First Lady was there. A number of the president's top aides were there. What was it like being in that room with that press conference?
Well, I was standing just behind Chief of Staff Kelly and the National Security Advisor, John Bolton. So they had their backs to me, but they were very stoic during all of this. But it was obvious, I think, for everybody in the room that we were witnessing something historic. And maybe if you were in the Trump administration, not in a very good way. Because what we had seen throughout that trip was at NATO in Brussels, at London, at Chequers, that the president was bashing in public the allies of the United States. And here, when a lot of people thought he should be on the stage next to Vladimir Putin, doing some bashing of Russia's activities, that he was very sympathetic, it appeared. And so there was a tremendous disappointment.
Before we get to the issue of the allies, NATO, and the bashing, there were 2 American reporters who got questions. How is that established? You've been in the press corps, in the White House press corps for a long time. Who gets the questions, and how's that determined?
This was what is traditionally called a 2+2, when you have a bilateral that 2 American reporters would get to ask questions, and then 2 questions that the other leader would call on. And this one, the referee was the press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and we had the reporters from AP and Reuters called on, which no one's going to complain about the selection of the 2 wire agencies being called on.
So they were selected ahead of time. It wasn't just raising their hand and getting spotted by the president.
Sarah called out their names.
I got it.
Yes.
All right, and the Russian reporters, we don't have any information on that?
As you know, most of the media in Russia now is pretty closely allied with the Kremlin, and so I don't think the questions from them were surprising, but it was the answers to the questions from both Putin and from Trump, from the American reporters, that really made the headlines.
All right, now let me go to London, where the president gave an interview to The Sun, which is a newspaper owned by Rupert Murdoch, who incidentally also owns Fox News Channel, or is a substantial shareholder, and I should say, but runs it. He made some insulting remarks, and then he had to backpedal with the Prime Minister, Theresa May. What happened?
It was a very sensitive time for the president to be making any comments about internal British politics, because the foreign minister, Boris Johnson, had just resigned over disagreement with the Brexit plan, the exit from the European Union that Theresa May's government had come out. And the president was seen as saying that he had given advice to the prime minister about how to pursue Brexit, which she didn't listen to. And he praised Boris Johnson, saying he'd make a great prime minister. So this was in a tabloid newspaper, a very highly circulated newspaper in the UK. And so this was a huge bombshell that was dropped right when he was having dinner with Theresa May.
There was some news made. You were overseas, so you may not know that, but there's a lot of, at least in U.S. media, that the president kept the Queen waiting, that he was late, and that he walked in front of her. Was that? I mean, is there any sort of anything you can add to that? Did we overdo it here in the United States, do you think? I mean, talking about it.
I think there was a lot of scrutiny, too, in Britain. They sort of microanalyze anything involving Donald Trump and any protocol that involves the Queen. But I think things are a bit looser these days than a lot of people think.
Did the president get more money, do you think, out of NATO, those other countries upping their contribution, a greater commitment? They're supposed to up it by 2014, but did he get any headway?
There's nothing that was signed, sealed, and delivered, but certainly the pressure and the rhetoric that the president was speaking in Brussels at that time forced the NATO leaders into an emergency meeting and to come out with some stronger verbal commitments. Now, again, whether there's follow-through on all of this, but definitely the type of rhetoric he was engaged in with rhetoric is certainly going to give us a higher degree of a chance that they will meet their commitments.
All right. We went over on Air Force One with the president. You didn't come back on Air Force One because you weren't at the pool. But is the White House seeing this trip overseas as a total success, medium success, or the jury's still out, or was a flop?
Well, I think what was happening when President Trump got on Air Force One to come back, he thought it was a roaring success. And only when he turned on the television in Air Force One and saw the grim faces on his advisors did he realize, well, perhaps things didn't go as well as I thought they did standing next to Vladimir Putin. And we've seen a number of blips, major setbacks for Trump, both on the campaign trail with the tape that came out and also with the Charlottesville statements. He recovered from those. Will he recover from this one and bounce back? that remains to be seen.
Steve, thank you very much. We're going to have much more on this historic trip of the president's, including his historic summit with the Russian President Vladimir Putin in a moment. Joining us to analyze the Trump-Putin summit is Dalibor Rohak, a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and James Robbins, a senior fellow for national security at the American Foreign Policy Council. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. Jim, first to you. Looking back, I realize it's very early after this summit, and sometimes we have to wait weeks, months, maybe even years to see, the impact of the summit. But your thoughts on this summit with the president of Russia?
Well, I think the president's performance at the press conference is going to be long remembered, whether rightly or wrongly. It's important that he walked back those statements that people took such umbrage at. Having a good relationship with Russia is better than having a bad relationship. That's true. President Obama spent 8 years trying to do that and not doing very well at it. Whether we see an improved relationship, whether issues like Crimea, Ukraine, support for Iran, Syria come to the fore in the follow-on meetings, that will really determine the long-term impact. But in the short term, we're going to have to wade through this morass of politics. Delbert,
it always strikes me in these when a president goes overseas or does something that we might gasp at. I mean, the statement when he undermined U.S. intelligence in Russia, but then came here and made a second statement, is that it seems like it's that's a huge deal, and it may very well be. But what is the actual impact, other than that we in the media have seized upon it, and so have some in his own party, and of course his political opponents?
I agree that the performance at the press conference was appalling, that his attempt to row back yesterday was not very convincing. I think we should be cautious about using hyperboles, like the idea that this in some sense constituted treason. I think the president's statements can be criticized on their own grounds. In terms of the impact in Russia, I wouldn't expect that much in the immediate short term. I think there is an internal logic to what Vladimir Putin is doing to his behavior internationally, which, this summit might have played into in some sense, but I would not exclude Russia actually getting more aggressive in the months to come. But to that, I think this summit has contributed only marginally.
Jim, what does Putin want?
What does Putin want? To maintain power, to expand Russia's influence in the world, to get the U.S. out of NATO and out of Europe. The typical traditional Russian foreign policy objectives. These are the things he wants. He would like to elevate Russia's status on the world stage, which I think he's doing successfully. And in general, just expand the area of Russian control. So I think that he's achieving this.
It's interesting, Dalibor, I'd say the president had, while he was standing next to him, had words of praise for the president, the Russian president. But I think you're not going to find many Americans who don't think that Russia was meddling, and Putin in particular, in our election. And so I'm thinking, do you think Putin thinks that he got away with this with the American people? And does he care?
I'm not sure he cares that much. I think this was a failure for our president in the sense that he likes to display power and influence and be sort of the alpha male in the room. He clearly failed to do that in that press conference. And when it comes to Russia, I think Russia is on the track of being a revisionist power. Vladimir Putin, after the decline of oil prices at the beginning of this decade, has started to sort of encourage Russians to reorient themselves towards a sort of patriotic mobilization, to sort of preserve the dignity of the motherland, expand Russia's sphere of influence, and he'll continue to do that unless there is pushback, unless there is deterrence from NATO's side.
Well, you know, it's fascinating to watch the press conference, and it was interesting to hear the remarks. And of course, you know, we put both of them, they're both on a stage, and we test and we listen to every single word. But they met for 2 hours at least before. I mean, like, that's what we don't know much about, do we? So, what were they talking about for those 2 hours? Isn't that the intriguing question?
It's kind of intriguing. I think that the meeting itself is not extraordinary. This is part of Donald Trump's MO. We saw this with Kim Jong-un. He likes to establish the personal relationships.
But isn't that a good thing in diplomacy? I mean, to meet someone who might be your foe.
Sure, why not? I mean, if it works, it's fine. If you can establish that personal relationship, get things off on a good foot, I don't see anything wrong with it. The notion that Democrats now want to interrogate the interpreter who was there to find out, you know, what secrets were being passed, or, you know, what plots were being hatched.
Which has never, as far as I know, has never been done before, because presidents meet confidentially with a lot of world leaders.
Yes, and I would think that there'd be a constitutional issue with,
yes,
having this kind of thing. I mean, but it shows the kind of over-the-top reaction to these, what should be kind of an ordinary diplomatic process is now being so heavily politicized.
What do you think President Trump wanted out of this?
Well, first, I think it's sort of useful to say that relative to where some of the expectations were before the summit, it is quite reassuring that there were no major concessions made by the U.S. president in exchange for nothing, like the
Nobody got anything.
He made
except that we in the media got a lot of sound bites.
So that to me is a good outcome relative to acknowledging the takeover of Crimea or striking some bargain over Syria. I think the biggest story here is the future of NATO and the credibility of the alliance, which is being, I think, undermined slowly and by sort of bits and pieces by this president. To that end,
he has made remarks about NATO. He's not pulling the U.S. out of NATO. He has said that. But one of the big objections from the United States, and it goes back to President Obama as well, is that the United States' financial contribution to NATO, this president, even the former president, thinks the other nations aren't contributing, what they should. So that's not new.
Yeah, I think no, that there is a real.
In fact, there's even an agreement in 2024. They're all going to raise to 2% of their defense budget.
Yeah. The burden sharing issue goes back to Eisenhower. I mean, if you want to trace the history of it, this is not a new issue. And in 2017, NATO members did raise the amount that they were contributing to the alliance in response to Donald Trump's criticism, so it actually worked.
The one thing sort of curious, though, is the interview that he had on Fox News recently, in which he said to the anchor, the host said to him, "Well, I don't want my son fighting for Montenegro." And President Trump, I forgot exactly how President Trump, but that's sort of that was sort of new, is that because under NATO is that an attack on another country, NATO member, is an attack on every member.
Well, and the thing is that he didn't really have a good response to Carlson Tucker, and that was to me the disturbing thing, because the good response, I believe, is that the security guarantees extended through NATO actually reduced the likelihood of conflict, reduced the likelihood that Mr. Tucker's son would have to go to fight for Montenegro. I mean, this country went to war in the Balkans 20 years ago. It wasn't because of NATO, because of Article 5. It was because we found ethnic cleansing in the Balkans at the doorstep of Europe unacceptable at the time, and hopefully bringing these countries into NATO's fold, into the West's fold, will decrease the likelihood of similar things happening in the future.
As a side, I have to throw in that there's ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, the Rohingya, which is getting unaddressed by the world, but that's a whole other issue. NATO, that article that we're one attack on another country, is 9/11 the only time that's been invoked, that article, which says an attack on a NATO member is an attack on all of us?
I think so.
I think it is the only one.
Although, well, there have been other invocations for NATO to take action, say in Libya, but that was the only one where it was an external aggression.
Is NATO stronger today than it was 2 weeks ago?
I don't believe so. I understand the concern about burden sharing. I understand that European underinvestment in defense is a real issue, but the way President is going about addressing it, I think, risks being worse than the underlying disease. If European countries just unilaterally increase their defense spending, I think the real risk, if it's not happening in a coordinated fashion as a sort of European pillar of NATO, it risks bringing back regional rivalries that NATO was designed to eliminate.
And sort of folding into that was the president's comment about Germany being captive of Russia. I thought that was interesting. You know,
yeah, that was
I don't
intriguing.
think Angela Merkel would like that.
Well, it was an interesting political jab, you know, saying that you rely on Russia for your energy, so you know, why are you funneling money that way when you should be defending yourself? It was judo on his part. Very interesting.
But you know, it's funny is no matter what he says about NATO, I can't imagine in my lifetime that the U.S. would ever get wobbly on NATO, even if the U.S. is paying a lot of money. That's been a very strong alliance for decades.
I don't think the U.S. will get wobbly on it. I think that we'll stay in it. It's an important security thing. The thing to watch is what Russia will do on the margins, like in the Baltic states, like Estonia. Not so much Montenegro, but would we go to war if Russia nipped off a piece of Estonia the way that they nipped off a piece of Ukraine? That would be an interesting, provocative move from Mr. Putin.
Well, we've got Crimea too. I mean, that was which not so long ago.
Not a NATO member, but
not a NATO member.
That model, yes.
I think within the current context, there is also an opportunity for people to restate what the purpose of NATO is, why it's valuable, why it matters to Americans. And I think there is a very strong case to be made for NATO being good for Europe, being good for America, being good for the world. And I don't think that case has been made for quite a while. So if President Trump opens this conversation, and if we sort of end up with a stronger argument for NATO as a result, I think that would be a good thing.
You know, I think at most, as be my guess, is there's a lot of, no matter about the talk, is that I think American people are very much devoted, and I think everybody in the government is devoted to NATO. You know. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Before we go, an update on a story that we have been following closely on this show. 2 Reuters journalists jailed in December by Myanmar authorities for their reporting on a massacre of the Rohingya. Well, the trial has now begun for journalists Walon and Jo So-u. They are charged with breaching Myanmar's Official Secrets Act. Walon, though, told the court a policeman had insisted on a meeting where the policeman abruptly handed over papers to them, and minutes later, the reporters were then arrested. Walon also told the court that police questioning, though, since they've been arrested, centered on their reporting of a massacre of Rohingya Muslims and not holding those documents they were given by the police. Both journalists have now pleaded not guilty to the charges. They have now been jailed more than 220 days. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And do follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thanks for being plugged in.